And then I'll just also give a quick sort of agenda for what's going to be happening here. And then we will get things started, okay? So welcome, this is our normal class meeting time for Journalism 103, Introduction to Mass Media and Society. So in this course, which is the first required course in our sequence of required courses in the journalism school, this course is really treated as an investigation of what the role of media in society ought to be, what it is, how it functions as an institution in society. We spend our time, at least so far, we've just finished our first unit, talking about some very general understandings, some theories about media effects, how to understand the interaction between media and society and other institutions. And we are just about to begin after a guest lecture today and another one on Wednesday. We'll begin looking more specifically at how media organizations operate. So people's particular roles within the organization, how you get socialized into that role, what those responsibilities are. And then eventually we'll start to look at other sorts of facets of media. So looking at issues of diversity and representation, looking at, yeah, I sort of drew a blank there for a second, but issues related to representation and other things within media messages themselves and why those are important. So I think in some ways our discussion here today will be very useful and fruitful for those discussions, particularly in the future, but also hoping to touch on some of our guests' experiences in navigating the various media institutions that she has also been a part of. So with that being said, what we're going to do today is the agenda is going to be as follows. After my brief introductory remarks here, I will toss it over to Professor Caesar Andrews to introduce our guest. After his introduction, then we will engage into a question and answer session with our guest, Wanda Lloyd. And then it will be officially open. I will exercise my authority, I guess, as the moderator to maybe get things started with a few questions for our guest, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. In fact, I fully expect that the participants will be really driving the Q&A session. So in order to make that happen, I'm going to ask that everybody just continues to have themselves muted. And if you have a question, to just enter it into the chat box down below. And I've asked the two teaching assistants for this class, Kylene and Ojala, who are here. I don't know if you have your grid up, but you can sort of wave. Potentially you can see them. They will be gathering the questions in the chat so that when it comes time for me to gather questions from the audience, rather than me try to dig through the chat to try to see where a question is, I'll simply ask Kylene or Ojala for one of the questions. I also did contact, some students reached out and said that they would be interested in ask a question as well too. So I will specifically call on them as well to ask the question when the time comes, okay? So if there are no other pressing issues, I think I'm gonna cede the floor to Professor Caesar Andrews to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome to everybody. I'm delighted that you are here. I appreciate that very much. Ben, if you don't mind, I want to say a little bit about you for people joining us from outside the confines of the Reynolds School. Dr. Birkenbein teaches a wide range of topics from the graduate level, subjects such as the First Amendment and media finance, and on to foundational courses of the kind that we are visiting today, Introduction to Media and Society. His research profile, which is robust, includes open source software, digital commons, international media ownership, and a bunch of other stuff. And as Ben mentioned, he will serve as our moderator today. The Leonard Ethics Chair is supported by the family of Paul Leonard, who was an editor of the predecessor of the current Reno Gazette Journal. And more specifically, it's supported this chair that I hold by the Reverend Jackie Leonard. The chair brings in media figures to talk about issues of the day and to share their insight on various issues, including insights into themselves. I am absolutely delighted that Wanda Lloyd is our Leonard speaker for this occasion and for a number of other classes during the course of this week. During her distinguished career, she broke many, many barriers as a female and as an African-American editor and manager. This legacy includes serving as a senior editor at USA Today and as executive editor at the Montgomery Advertiser in Alabama. After her career in newsrooms, she chaired the journalism program at Savannah State University in her hometown of Savannah, Georgia. In 2019, Wanda was inducted into the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame. She has received an honorary degree from Spelman College, which is her alma mater, for her service over many years on that university's board. That's just a small sampling of the honors that she has received. I can tell you from knowing her, we actually worked for the same company for many years. And I can tell you that that she was and is highly respected as a leader and is known for many great things. Among those is her passion for advocating and advancing diversity in media. Wanda is apparently one of those people who overachieves, because in addition to all of that, and this could go on, but we got to get to the discussion, she published her memoir this year, Coming Full Circle, From Jim Crow to Journalism. Thank you, Dr. Ben. She will start with an excerpt, I believe, and then Ben will start the conversation as he discussed. With that, please welcome Wanda Lloyd. I'm thankful that you're here. Thank you very much, Wanda.
Thank you very much. I got you. Thank you, Caesar. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I was just looking at the numbers. We have 142, so that's really good. I'm excited to meet all of you. I am thrilled to be a part of your campus this week. As you've heard, I have been and will be speaking to classes and in different forums throughout the week. So this is just real pleasure for me, for what we used to call an old newspaper editor. Yeah, that's really what I am, an old newspaper editor. So thank you so much. Before I read from my memoir, I want to tell you that my memoir is my story of growing up in the segregated Jim Crow South in Savannah, Georgia, during a time when we were told what we could do, where we could go, how we would live our lives. And you're going to hear a little bit of that in my reading. Yet, being exposed to journalism in the 11th grade in high school, and I wish we had more high school journalism classes these days. I don't know where you guys are, but in my part of the country, they don't even teach journalism in high school anymore. But having been exposed to journalism by a teacher who, of course, all my teachers are Black and all the students in our school were Black, a teacher who never had the opportunity to even set foot in a daily newspaper newsroom. She taught everything we learned from a book, yet she managed to inspire me to become a journalist through the work we did with the school paper, and also by asking me to accept the position of being the editor-in-chief of the Beach Beacon at Beach High School in Savannah back in the late 70s. I'm sorry, late 60s. Oh my goodness, late 60s. And so that was my first top editor position in high school. And then I went on to become editor of my college paper, and things, the rest is history. And so this is a book about, it's my story. And I say that in the book, this is my story of rising from Jim Crow through the ranks and becoming a top editor. So I'm going to read for you from the preface of Coming Full Circle, because it kind of sets up what the book is about. So if you will indulge me for about three or 4 minutes. I grew up in Savannah, just off the coast of Georgia, at a time when there were 2 societies, one Black and one white. For every accommodation that existed for white people, there was a separate yet unequal accommodation for colored people, or Negroes as we were called at the time. It was long after I became an adult and moved away before I learned just how different those societies were. Ours was a community whose teachers had superior expectations for our academic success, even though they were forced to teach us in substandard facilities with hand-me-down books and furniture carted over from the white schools, cementing in our mind the fact that we were considered second-class citizens. In Savannah, I grew up in a solidly middle-class, well-educated family. If you want to read a poor me story, this is not the place. Mine is not a rags to riches story, yet among African Americans, there was no distinction between class or income during the Jim Crow years. We endured the city's separate and subpar facilities. Between us, African Americans had great respect for each other, but laws dictated that white people would consider us second-class citizens, no matter who we were. I stepped into adulthood crossing the bridge between full segregation and the civil rights movement. As a child, I attended some of the movement's mass meetings in churches in Savannah. Later, as a student at Spelman College, I saw and heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak at a standing room only and spiritually rousing evening service at Mount Moriah Baptist Church. The civil rights movement left me appreciative of the right to worship God without fear of reprisal and to vote without fear of sanction, and grateful for the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. I have enjoyed the benefits of freedom of the press and have celebrated that I could go to any school or work in any place where I am qualified to be. Somehow, I made it into journalism despite growing up in a place where I did not have African American or female role models in the profession. In our community, television news and mainstream newspaper ranks were filled with white men. I read the Black press and our local daily newspapers, but still, my world was small. Ultimately, I rose to a place in my career where I was able to address the lack of diversity and to help make the path easier for women and people of color to make their own difference through the stories they would tell or the newsrooms they would run. My journey is outlined here in this book with hopes that younger generations of women, African Americans, and others will be inspired to knock down walls and push through glass ceilings. It took more than 20 years to get as far away from Savannah's systematic oppression as I could, and it took about the same additional time to figure out how to return and help make my hometown better. So thank you very much for allowing me to read. Do you want to start the questions now, Ben, or do you want me to talk some more?
Yeah, that's really great. In fact, I think it's a great excerpt to read because it very nicely dovetails with some of my questions anyways. I think that in some ways I'll just thank you for coming to class today and to share your experiences with our students. I think it's going to be a really valuable conversation for them. I think that the book itself does a really good job of giving, stressing the importance of history and trying to understand that history, as well as your experience, but also what really comes through is your sort of passion for diversity and leadership particularly. And one of the things that I wanted to begin to ask you about, I was going to try to ask a question about each one of those, sort of history, experience, and then maybe diversity and leadership, if I could. Okay. First, I'll ask you maybe just a little bit of a personal history question. I'm glad that you mentioned your experience at your high school newspaper, so the Beach Beacon, and then later your experience at Spelman with the Spelman Spotlight. And I'm just wondering if you could begin by talking a little bit about how you view the role of the student press and the importance of student press and to journalism education kind of generally for the next generation of journalists.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think the role is very important. And even though they're not teaching journalism in high school and college, there is still the student press. I found it difficult as chair of the department at Savannah State when I went there to chair the journalism program to get students to understand the importance of journalism because they had not had those lessons in high school for the most part. And so the foundation that I got in high school was extremely important to help students understand what's going on around them, to help students focus on current events, as we used to call them in our social studies classes. I found in my case that a lot of the students that I encountered at Savannah State and elsewhere, because I actually worked at 4 different universities, some of them simultaneously while I was working in newsrooms, I found it a chore sometimes to get students to understand how important it is to know, to follow what's going on in the news every day. They tune in and out, and especially now it's really difficult because, people don't sit down before the evening news like we used to for half an hour and just get a little bit of everything that was going on before. People don't read a daily newspaper every day. In fact, a lot of communities don't even have a daily newspaper, and I get that, but everybody has digital. So I think it's really important for people to understand that even though the media is changing, having that foundation in high school, even if it's a digital publication or broadcast in high school, is really, really important. I would hope that college students would understand their role also to mentor younger journalists, because I got mentored not by professionals, but I certainly had teachers who mentored me, even though they didn't have the opportunity to do that. So I think scholastic press is just really important. In fact, I'll also share with you that my first college journalism course took place between my junior and senior year in high school, when the organization I later learned to be was the Dow Jones Newspaper Fund had a high school workshop for high school teachers at Savannah State, which was then Savannah State College. And they were teaching Black teachers how to teach journalism, again, through a book. But they also wanted to include a few high school students in that summer workshop. And so I was one of 6 students who they call pilot students. And we learned journalism by having the teachers who were learning how to teach journalism teach us how to put out our newspaper.
Very nice. Yeah. In fact, I was just reflecting a little bit on your comments there, because it occurred to me that in previous iterations of this class, although I don't know that I've asked it specifically for this group, I generally ask students whether they had any journalism education in high school. And I would say that the fairly common response is that only about 30% of the students in the class will have had any high school education for journalism. So I usually use that as a starting point to say, like, listen, so we need to all just understand where we're at so that we can all move forward together. Some people, some of the things you'll be learning here will be redundant potentially, or something you've heard before, but others maybe have not got those lessons yet. So we need to move forward from there. I was also going to ask you a little bit about your experience. As I said, and you very nicely laid out when you read from the preface, that it strikes me you have all of these great anecdotes and stories about your own navigation of various media outlets, various publications throughout your career, and particularly given your history of growing up in Savannah and under Jim Crow. I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about how you learned to navigate various publications, and particularly, as a sort of, as a woman of color, at various points in the book, you talk about offhanded comments about women and other experiences that you've had. And maybe for those students that have not had a chance to read the book, just maybe talk generally about how you navigated various, institutional situations, whatever the publication was. And then also maybe share one of those stories potentially that of a moment when you were really confronted with what was going on there.
Okay. I mentioned in the preface that there were no professional journalism role models for me, because everyone who worked in our local media was white and male. And we didn't even know those people. I mean, we saw them on television, but there was no way for us to get to know them. And so I think the way I navigated was just to observe. I had to see, sort of observe what's going on around me. And I really didn't acquire a mentor until about 15 years into my career. It was really when I went to the Gannett Company after I had been at 4 other daily papers, including the Washington Post, for 11 years. So it really took me observing what was going on. And you know, like all journalists, you know, we're taught to be curious, to look at what's going on around us, to listen all the time. And so that's really how I learned to navigate. I also did not have, for the early years of my career, very many people who looked like me, even in my newsroom. My first newsroom, there was one other woman in the newsroom in a professional role. There was some other ladies who were taking dictation from the reporters back in the day when everything was on typewriters and stories got called in. But there was there was a reporter in the newsroom in Providence, Rhode Island. In Miami, there were a few other journalists of color, and we sort of bonded together, and we taught each other a lot of the things that we needed to know about how to navigate in the newsroom, and the same at the Washington Post. And so to share a story or two, at the Miami Herald, the Knight Ridder Company, which owned the Miami Herald at the time, did a really good job of reaching out to journalists of color, especially African Americans. In fact, I think we were all African Americans at first, to invite us to come and work there. They did a really good job of bringing those numbers into the newsroom. I was the only copy editor. I started my career as a copy editor, as you learned in the book. I've never been a full-time daily newspaper reporter. And so we supported each other, but what they did not do is they did not train the editors on why we were there and how to make us feel welcome and how to make sure that we were getting an equal shot at the kinds of assignments that reporters like to get. Assignments for page 1, assignments to position us to have stories that would be in line for awards, because as you know, that's where you get recognized. If you get your local awards and your state press association awards, and then the national awards. And it was very difficult. Quite frankly, most of the Black journalists in the newsroom at that time had a master's degree already. There were journalists in the Miami Herald, white journalists, who didn't even have a college degree, because you didn't really have to have a college degree to start in journalism. When I started in journalism, I was a little bit rare in that regard as well. And so that would be one of the situations where we just had to support each other. I tell a story in the book about how we used to have a meeting in the ladies' room, literally. We would have, you know, one of our reporters would call and say, oh my gosh, my editor just insulted me and told me I wasn't smart enough to do this, to get this assignment, and I really need to just talk to some people. So we would just say, come on, let's go in the ladies' room. And we would call each other up on the phone right there, the desk phone. There were no cell phones. And we would meet and we would just cry on each other's shoulder. And so we supported each other. We learned that I think I named that chapter the family, it's about my family in Miami. Mm-hmm. Another situation that I found myself in at the Washington Post. So I went to the Washington Post largely because I became engaged to someone who lived in the Washington area. But I had heard from the Washington Post several times before I was ready to go there, because they were trying to recruit African Americans to go into the newsroom, because in those years there just weren't a lot of Black copy editors in the whole country. And so I had several opportunities that I had turned down. I didn't even go interview. But when I was ready to move to Washington, I did call the recruiter, and I did get the job at the Washington Post. The first job they put me in was not on the copy desk, even though I tried out for the copy desk and qualified for that. They put me in the composing room, which, you know, as I look back on it, I was a production editor. That was actually a pretty nice kind of a perk in terms of the value they saw in me, because I was literally the last person to see copy every time during my shift. I was the very last person to see the copy and the headlines and the layout of the pages before they proofed those pages and sent them back up to the composing room. So they really put a lot of value in my experience. However, there were some situations in that composing room where it was a room full of men. I was the only woman in the composing room. I was the only person of color in the composing room. No woman, no Black person had ever worked in the composing room at the Washington Post. And so during that time when I was working at night, because all the work was on deadline at night. I think I started at 7:30 at night and worked until about 2 o'clock in the morning every shift. I started hearing some of the men, older white men, say disparaging words about women, about body parts. And, they weren't talking about me. They were talking about maybe their wives or their girlfriends or some woman they saw on the street. But it was just very disconcerting for me as a young woman, because I was 26 years old, newly married, literally had been married 2 weeks when I got there. And it was just it made me very uncomfortable. There also were times when, and your students will not understand this, but you have to imagine that we were working over these tables with the lead type, the hot type, and you had to bend over the table and point to the part of the page that you wanted to make a correction, but you could not touch the table because of some union rules. And I never wanted to be responsible for touching anything, but I had to learn to lean over. So the first thing I had to do, I never wore pants to work until I went to the Washington Post. I had to go buy a wardrobe of pants, because leaning over the tables, I knew I did not want to do that in a skirt. And the second thing that I discovered, that as I was leaning over there, sometimes men would brush up against me, brush their body against my behind. And I knew that that was on purpose. And I felt very uncomfortable. So again, as a young woman, as an African-American, as a newlywed, I just knew something was wrong. What I did not know was what to call it. I don't even know if the term sexual harassment was a thing at that time. But I did finally get up the courage to go back up to the newsroom and say to the news editor, who was my boss, that I just demanded that I be transferred upstairs to the newsroom and work on the copy desk. And he granted me that. I never told him why I made that request.
That's great. Yeah, you know what? I have more questions, but I see questions rolling in the chat. So I'm just going to defer to some of the other folks who are asking questions. So Kylene, have you got maybe like a first question that we can ask Wanda here?
Yes, thanks, Ben. This question is from Jose Cadena, if he prefers. He wants to know what it was like to witness Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech.
Oh my goodness. It was very emotional. We realized the uniqueness of that situation. I think, I'm not sure, but I think as a younger child, I heard Dr. King speak just because I went back and I looked at some of the times he came to Savannah to some of those meetings. But I was so young that I probably was sitting there with a coloring book or something, not paying attention to what was going on or what he said. But as a college student, and we were freshmen, it was very emotional. First of all, the room was packed. It was hot. It was a church. It was just steamy in there. And you could just, the emotions were it just came out through the room. As I said, a spiritually rousing speech. He talked about civil rights. He talked about our role as students and why it was important for us to get involved. Interestingly enough, in 1968, when Dr. King passed away, they brought his body back to Spelman College, and he was in Sisters Chapel for a number of days so that people in the community in Atlanta, which was his hometown, had to come onto Spelman's campus to view the body. And so those of us who were students at the time were serving as, I don't know if you call it escorts. We were helping to take care of the children. So the children were in line because everybody in Atlanta wanted to bring their families to see Dr. King's body. And the children were getting restless, and sometimes they had to go to the bathroom. So our role was to sort of pluck the children out of line, take them to get them a drink of water, or go to the bathroom and bring them back to their parents. So those were the two times that I had an encounter with Dr. King.
Nice. And actually next, maybe, I think it was at Aisha, did you have a question as well too? Did you want to ask your question real quick?
Sure thing. Thank you for talking to us today. What is your vision for better media and representation of Black voices, and how do we support that? How do we best support that as both students and practitioners?
We have been working on this diversity in media topic for decades, literally decades. It started probably in 1968, even though, they were recruiting us in the late 60s and 70s. but in earnest in 1978, when the American Society of Newspaper Editors started what we call a census or a count of the people of color, specifically in those years, African Americans, to be sure that our voices were in the newspapers, that our presence was in the newsrooms, and that we had representation of certain kinds of stories. There was something called the year 2000 goal, where we were dead set on having this goal where we would have representation that equal parity in the community. That is, the percentage of people in the community would also be the percentage of people in newsrooms. Very soon recognized that that wasn't going to happen, that newspapers weren't hiring fast enough, and also the percentage of people of color was growing, because guess what? Not only was the birth rate changing a little bit, but we encompassed all the other kinds of diversity, people who are Hispanic, people who are Asian American, Native American, and of course Black people. And so the rule was the year 2000 goal was changed to, I believe, the year 2025. That is the new goal. In 2008, with the recession, everything shut down. There was no more hiring, and at the beginning of the recession, the last hired were the first to be let go. And so that severely hurt diversity, because a lot of those people were people who looked like me. And so the numbers just sank. I do see now, though, I hear from some of my colleagues in newsrooms that they really are looking for a way to jumpstart diversity. I will tell you, I believe it when I see it, but I'm starting to see little cracks in that. And I can tell you that 2 news companies, I won't call them newspaper companies, recently asked me to talk to some of their journalists and some of their executives about my experience in helping to diversify newsrooms and give them some of the tools. And we developed a lot of tools back in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so I'm starting to see some interest. Is that because there's a lot of money there now? No, it's because, quite frankly, of this new anti-racism movement after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others. Now, news organizations and other corporations as well are really starting to take it seriously, I think. So I have hope, fingers crossed, that it's going to get better, that there will be more people who look like me and representation will be better.
That's great. And actually, I did see one question here. This is from Catherine as well. And it sort of, it also dovetails with what you were saying there. She asks, how as journalists can we understand our current situation within this new wave of civil rights? So it seems like almost a historical question of like your experience with sort of civil rights movement historically, and then how does that inform what we're seeing today?
I hope it informs it. I think the first step is to do a little bit of what you're doing tonight, and that's understanding our history. You know, what's the saying? In order to know where we're going, we have to know where we've been. And so I think it's important for people to inform themselves about where we have been so that you can build on that history. I think it is important to think about the tools. There are so many tools. I mean, we could do a whole hour and a half just on the tools to help newsrooms and news organizations be successful at diversity. You know, we had so many programs in the 1990s and the early 2000s to boost those numbers. Caesar and I believe we both graduated from one of them, and that was the Management Training Center. Did you go through that one too, Caesar? I think you did. So the Management Training Center was one that trained people of color to become, they really used to call it a publisher's school, teaching us how to run a newspaper, not just a newsroom, the business side as well. Because in order to address issues of diversity, you have to address the business. You have to understand the business imperative for diversity. What is that imperative? To making people feel comfortable with and feel that the media is accurate, because diversity really is accuracy. So I'm hoping that we're at a point now where we really are going to address some of those issues and look at some of those tools. There are so many. In fact, you know, people are asking me so much about them now, maybe I should write a book about tools. All I'd have to do literally is go on my bookshelf and a few other places in my house and pull together all those pamphlets that we put out through the organizations that were leaders in media and just update them for digital. That's really all we have to do.
Very good. Ojala, do we have some more, like another question too that you had picked out from the students?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Bunn. And thank you, Wanda, for coming to speak with us. So a question I see here from Nina is, how do journalists deal with backlash, hate, anger from the public through social media, private messages, voicemail, etc.? What about the death threats and other destructive or abusive reactions?
Well, you know, you have to have a thick skin. You have to be careful because, you know, I've certainly been in situations where I've felt threatened, but I've never really believed that my life could be hurt. I really believe now that some of the things that happened to me 10, 15 years ago were to happen today, I would really be concerned about it because people are serious now. But you do have to have a thick skin. You cannot be deterred in journalism. You do have to have conversations with the people who are running the news organizations so that you have the right protections. You know, we have heard so many journalists who have died in the line of duty or been hurt in the line of duty. We don't want that to happen to anyone. And so be honest and have those conversations. Don't hide under a rock when it happens. And be sure you have those conversations with the people who are the leaders in your organization. Very, very, very important. You just have to keep pushing. You know, I remember a time, well, I think the thing that affected me the most, I had a meltdown once in my newsroom when I was executive editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. I woke up one morning to an email from someone who identified himself as a Mr. Kinston. I have no idea if that was his real name. And he was angry that we were putting Black people in the newspaper. He was just not happy with that in positive stories. That is, it wasn't about having, you know, pictures of young Black men's mugshots in the newspaper. It was, you know, doing feature stories on people who were from diverse backgrounds, doing feature stories on business people who were women and people of color. And he was just angry that his newspaper had changed so much with the time. And I thought he was only sending those emails to me, and I found out he was sending them to all people of color in the newsroom. And so I did report it to the publisher, but they just kept going on and on and on over a number of days. And I just had a meltdown one day. You know, my meltdown lasted maybe a couple of hours, and then I had to just, as we say, put on my big girl panties and walk back into that newsroom. And my publisher followed me in the newsroom and called everybody together and said, "We know what's going on. You all know what's going on. I want you to know that Wanda's the editor. She has my support, and we're just going to get back to work." And that's exactly what we did. So we keep on pushing because it's very important. We cannot go backwards. We have to go forward.
Kylene, did you also have another question that came from the students there?
Yes, well, I think I'm going to go to one of Caesar's questions. I think he's attempting to educate everyone. The question is, who or what is Jim Crow?
Oh, good question. Let me tell you why Jim Crow was important in this book. As I was chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications at Savannah State, I was having conversations with all the seniors because, as you know, as a department chair, all the seniors have to come through my office at some point so that I can make sure that all they've taken all the classes that they have to take and all everything's in order. And after those conversations, the students we would have sort of a career chat or a conversation just to go over. They would ask me questions about my background. Where did I come from? They knew I hadn't been in the academy all of my career. And so I would tell them about the fact that I had been an editor at 7 daily newspapers. But where did you come from? What city? And I told them that I grew up in Savannah. I was gone for 40 some years. I came back to Savannah to take that position. And they would say something like, "Well, what was your favorite restaurant when you lived in Savannah?" excuse me, but we didn't go to restaurants when I was in Savannah. Well, what school did you go to? Did you go to Savannah High School? Well, no, I went to a school that was segregated. And so this was news to a lot of the students because, quite frankly, most of the students at Savannah State are not from Savannah. Probably about 20% are from Savannah, but they mostly are all from the South. And so I started explaining to them the concept of Jim Crow. It appeared that in their education, and maybe you young folks can identify with this, it appeared that there were lessons in high school about slavery, a little bit of Reconstruction, and then the Civil Rights Movement. And everybody sort of skipped over Jim Crow. And so I had to explain to them that Jim Crow was a legal restriction. It was the law, the separateness in our society, especially in the South. There were Jim Crow laws all over the country, but especially in the Southeast, where slavery had been so much of the tradition. And that we could not go to restaurants or certain schools, that we almost all places of worship were segregated, still are to some extent. We had our own businesses. We had our own little West Broad Street was the street of commerce in our community. We often, in some stores, could not try on clothes in the store because we were Black. We could not try, the ladies could not try on hats in the stores. In some places during Jim Crow, you couldn't even try on shoes. Jim Crow was also a time when people were threatened for sometimes saying the wrong things to a white person or whistling at a white woman. I don't know how many of you know Emmett Till, the story of Emmett Till, but that's what happened. That's why he was killed, because I believe he was whistling at a white person, a white woman in Mississippi. And so we had to learn at a very early age how to be safe, how to protect ourselves. We had water fountains that were labeled literally white and most of the time colored. We had separate toilets. And so I wanted to address a lot of these stories in the book about Jim Crow. I also read quite a few books as I was in the writing process about the Jim Crow era. I read slave narratives also because I had to understand what was it in the mindset of people who made the laws after I believe it started in the 1870s through 1965. What was in the mindset of people who made those laws that would force us to live in these two societies? And so I learned a lot about Jim Crow, not how it was executed because I lived that was my experience, but I learned about how it came about. So I hope that's a good explanation, Caesar, of what Jim Crow was. And I don't know how many of you saw the movie last year, The Green Book. That's another example of Jim Crow, because when we traveled, we could not stay in hotels. We could not ride on some public transportation. And when we did ride on public transportation, things like long transportation like trains and interstate buses, we had to ride in separate cars on trains and at the back of the buses. And of course, in many communities, the public buses, the buses that ran in the community were also separated front and back, which is where we learned about what Rosa Parks did because she refused to give up her seat on a bus.
Very good. I actually see one question here from Claudia Cruz, who's our internship coordinator, but she also supervises Noticiero Móvil, which is our Spanish language student Spanish language newspaper or publication. And she's asking, we do not have an affinity group at the journalism school, so like the National Association of Black Journalists or Hispanic Journalists, etc. Are these organizations still necessary? Or more or less, and any advice for how to make it successful?
Yes, they are still necessary. Until inequality and racism are erased, they are still necessary. When we go to the National Association of Black Journalists Conference every year, and the same with the other affinity groups, we are around a family of people that will take us, and I'm one of those people who now takes people under the wing. We will mentor students. We conduct workshops. There is still a workshop every year in the National Association of Black Journalists that's called something like Coping in the Newsroom. Coping in the newsroom means here I am, I'm Black, I'm young, I want to have better assignments, I want a better job in the same place I am. Tell me what to do. How can I cope? How do I have those conversations in my newsroom? Should I go to my editor? How do I find a mentor? Those are still very necessary. What I'm happy about is that every 4 years, the Black and Hispanic journalists get together and have a conference, which we had this past summer. And so we're starting to understand that a lot of the issues that we are facing are some of the same issues for all people of color. And so many times we are sharing resources, but it is still necessary. And I would encourage universities to have that kind of group, because when young people get into the real newsroom or the real work world, you're going to find a necessity for that. And it's not just how to cope, it's also how do you find stories? How do you find stories, even if you're doing a workshop on database journalism? How do you find stories in your own community? Because sometimes there are differences in the kinds of stories and the kinds of resources. And then there are language differences. There are cultural differences. So I think it's important to have those affinity groups.
Nice. Ojala, I know that I've sort of jumped around a little bit with some of the questions, but did you have one too that came from the list here?
Yeah, so actually, I think Wanda's offered so much insight to a great deal of the questions. I was looking through the list. I think one maybe we can ask is posed here by Martin Ness. Do you feel or do you think that the new platforms and current mediums are helping with diversity in journalism?
I think so. One of the reasons I think so is because people have access, hopefully. People who, when we had daily newspapers, if everybody didn't read the newspaper or didn't purchase a newspaper or subscribe to the newspaper, they just didn't get the information. Now with digital platforms, just about everybody has one of these, a cell phone. And so it's easier to share that information. So I think that's very important. The digital platforms are so accessible, and there are statistics that show that the disparity in some homes, people of color who do not have internet access at home overwhelmingly have more cell phone service and more cell phones. They own more cell phones than the white majority in some cases. So again, it's a matter of access. And so those things are very important. The other important thing about the digital platforms is the immediacy of it. You don't have to wait till later in the day or tomorrow to read the news. You can read the news in about 10 minutes sometimes. In an hour. It changes all the time. It gets updated all the time. And so sometimes I feel like we're over-informed because there's so much of it going on. And, I wonder how we get anything else done in our lives because we're always attached to the cell phone or a tablet or a computer or a laptop or something. But I think it's becoming I've become increasingly aware that we're never going back, obviously, and that it's just really important especially for young people, because this is your world. I like to say now the babies are being born with a cell phone in their crib. They're learning how to use it at a very, very early age. So let's make the best of it. Let's be responsible with it, though. When we were on the cusp of the explosion of websites. And this is websites, not social media, but websites for every news organization. One of the things that I would say to my team, my staff, is we want to be first, but we also want to be accurate. And accuracy is very important. So if you have to hold up the news for a minute or two or an hour or two to get a fact verified, it's very important to do that and not put out information that's not factual. And that's difficult for a lot of journalists because they want to be first. They want to get it out there right away. And the editors want to be first, but the editors also realize that we must be factual.
I'm actually going to jump back to something you mentioned about the NABJ conferences, where you're providing sort of professional advice to people and really trying to get people to understand that. Because it also occurred to me that, well, first of all, some students are asking about kind of professional advice that you might give them for going forward. But I want to tie it back a little bit to your experience, because there were these moments in the book when you described making a career move. So you moved various places, you've got a lot of experience, lots of places, but there was one particular move where you said maybe you made it too quickly, and I'm forgetting exactly which one it was. Maybe that was when you moved back to Atlanta and you said, you know, maybe this wasn't the right idea, and you learned something about maybe when to make a career move, when would be the right time, as you were navigating kind of the professional world. So maybe you could speak a little bit more about those lessons.
Sure. So indulge me as I tell this story. So yes, it was Atlanta. When I was in college at Spelman College, the Atlanta newspaper company, Cox Newspapers, had a fellowship that they sponsored for college students who were from the South, and they wanted to encourage them to study journalism and stay in the South and become journalists. And I was the very first African-American to get one of these, the Ralph McGill Fellowship that was given by the Cox Company. I had been in Providence for the summer for my internship between my junior and senior year. And at the end of the summer, my editor said, my managing editor called me in and said, you've done a good job. We like what you do. We want you to come back after you graduate and work in Providence. You know, this Georgia girl had gone all the way up to Rhode Island for an internship. I said, there's no way I'm coming back to Providence, Rhode Island. I want to be in Atlanta. And I was determined to get a job at the Atlanta Constitution at that time. And so as I was preparing to graduate from Spelman, I made an appointment to meet with the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, who also before that time was the person who was sort of the curator of this Ralph McGill Fellowship. And so I had this meeting with him. I took my resume. I explained to him that the newspaper had helped pay for part of my education, that I want to work there. And I had been a copy editor in Providence in my internship. And they said, we want to hire you tomorrow, but we don't want to hire you as a copy editor. We want to hire you as a reporter. And the reason for that is they said that the Black people in the city, this is during the Civil Rights Movement at the end of it, wanted to see more people who look like us in the newsroom. And the only way to do that would be to see reporters on the street. And I said, thank you very much, but I'm a copy editor. And I proudly went back to Providence and accepted the position at the Providence newspaper. A few years later, I decided, I really do want to live in Atlanta. I liked Atlanta. I had gone to college in Atlanta. I wanted to be closer to my home in Savannah because my aunt who raised me was there. She was in Savannah by herself. And I thought, let me try to get a job in Atlanta. So I did go back got on a plane actually from Miami to Atlanta. And I went in and met with the editor one Saturday morning. And they didn't have a job at the time, but they thanked me very much for coming in. I went back home to Miami, and a few weeks later, I got a phone call from the managing editor at the Atlanta Journal saying, are you the Wanda Smalls who came in here looking for a job? Well, we have one now. You still want to work here? And I said, yes. I didn't ask questions. There was never a tryout for copy editors. The only way to know what we can do is to have a tryout because we don't have clips. And so every other job I had interviewed for, I had done a tryout for. I accepted this job to go back to Atlanta just because I wanted to be in Atlanta. It was the worst job I ever had. It occurred to me that I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't insist on a tryout. They wanted me. I wasn't sure I needed them. And what I found myself encountering was what was called a universal copy desk. That means we're all adults here, right? We were shoveling shit. They were literally just throwing stories at us. And I remember at the Washington Post, at the Miami Herald, I'm sorry, I remember counting how many stories I touched in a day. I never touched more than 6 to 10 stories in a day, which gave me plenty of time to edit the stories, write the headlines, talk to spend time with the photographer, crop the pictures, write the captions, get all the words right, all the layouts right, because I was also laying out pages. In Atlanta, this universal copy desk, all we did was just get stories, slap a headline on them, very little time to read. And one day I said, I'm going to count how many stories. I touched 60 stories that day. That's when I realized that I wasn't doing the quality of work I wanted to do. So sometimes it's not just going where you want to be. You really do have to ask the right questions. You really do have to make sure that it's the right fit for you at the time, whatever your skills are. And my skills were, I'm going to say, far advanced to what they needed at the Atlanta Journal, which was an afternoon paper. It doesn't exist anymore. So that's the story I wrote about in the book, about, you know, making the mistake of going back to Atlanta. I only stayed 6 months. Fortunately, I got engaged to a guy from the Washington area who I'd met in Providence. I got out of there really quickly. I was ready to go.
That's good. That's great. And good advice too. And I keep, you know, it's great whenever someone comes and to visit the class, and, you know, whenever the professor is lecturing about, you know, you got to be able to ask good questions. And I can't teach you how to be interested in the world, but that foundation of like asking good questions comes from a curiosity that, you know, you have to try to cultivate. And so,
and isn't it interesting that we can ask good questions about a story? We also have to know how to ask good questions about our own well-being, about the trajectory of our own careers. That's very important.
Exactly. And that's what I really loved about that last response. Kylene, did you pick up on another question? I know that there's a list there, and I know we've sort of touched on some of the themes and a lot of the questions, but was there another one that you picked out maybe that takes us in a different direction? Or
Sure. This one's from Jesus Segura. He's curious about what your opinion is about the media's portrayal of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, it's certainly, the volume of it is very great. You know, especially during the time right after the death of George Floyd, it was all we saw. I think, to me personally, sometimes it was overload. It made me not feel so good. Sometimes I got depressed because I was looking, and now that's my fault because I'm a news junkie and I was watching everything, and I found myself going from cable channel to cable channel. Every time the commercial would come on, I didn't want to miss anything. The coverage, I think there were some things that I saw them lag behind. For example, after the protests in Minneapolis, then we saw, following on the heels of the protests, the violence, the destruction in the community, throwing things in the windows, the looting. And I'm not sure the media understood right away. They didn't do a good job of reporting to find out that there were really two movements going on there. There was the protest movement, and then there was this other movement that I'm not sure we've even defined to this day. I didn't think the media did a good job of that initially. Finally caught up with it. But, you know, that's what I say about being first and fast, you know, putting it in, and also putting it in context. And I don't expect everybody who's working for the media to know this now because y'all are all younger. But if someone has stopped to think, let's ask someone who's a little bit older, who remembers the civil rights movement, about the pattern of how that movement happened after the death of Martin Luther King and all the looting that went on in our cities. A lot of that happened then. And so I would hope that the media would put more things into context. And I can't tell you how to put it into context. I just know that context is important. History is important. You know, there are so many books you can read about journalism, history, and I'm sure you get to read some of them in your school there, but it's very important to read some of those books. I read The Race Beat while I was writing. I had not read it yet, but that's a book that I would urge everybody to read, The Race Beat. It really talks about the history of covering race in America. I learned some things. I didn't know that there were news organizations in the North that were not covering the civil rights movement because they didn't want to rile up their readers in the North. They didn't want people to know what was going on in the South. So there's so many things that people really can learn about by revisiting history. And I didn't think the media did a good job, but otherwise they did a good job of, profiling the people in the movement, profiling the people who were killed. If it were not for the media and social media, we would never have known about the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of the officer's knee on George Floyd's neck. So I applaud people for that.
Very good. It looks like, so we're coming up probably about the last 10 minutes of our meeting here today. And I was also just seeing there were a couple more questions here now, but Wanda, was there anything that you wanted to share maybe that we didn't touch on today? I mean, that you've, whether it be advice for students who are aspiring media professionals in one way or another, whether that's journalism, strategic communication, or et cetera, or just anything else maybe that we hadn't touched on yet that you want to share?
Sure. So I do want to sort of pick up on that last question, because asking the question about whether the media did a good job of covering the Black Lives Movement, I had my own experience with that. During the protests, one of my best friends is a woman that was my college roommate. Her name is Tina, and we were freshman year roommates at Spelman College. And she called me one day during this whole uprising in Minneapolis and beyond. She lives in St. Simon's Island, Georgia, which is about 80 miles south of where I am. It happens to be the county where Ahmaud Arbery was killed. And so she, that was top of mind for her, because she was seeing it on local news and people were talking about it, I guess, in the grocery store, in the post office, and all the places that people talk about news like that. So she called me one day and she said, "Hey, how you doing?" And I said, "I'm not doing well. I'm very depressed. I'm frustrated. I'm angry. I can't do anything about it. And then we got COVID, so I can't even go out. I'm too old to get out there and protest. Let the young people do that." But I'm very hopeful seeing so many people of different races out there protesting and literally, putting their own lives on the line because of COVID. Fortunately, hopefully most were doing it safely. And she said, "Yeah, I'm depressed about it. I think we're on overload with the news." And we started talking about how we were feeling about the coverage. And I said, I'm starting to hear from some of my white friends. They're literally calling me or sending me emails or texts and saying, "Oh my God, I had no idea that all the racism that you and other Black people have been telling us about for years is as bad as it seems to be. We had no idea. People were just not believing this." And so Tina and I talked about, well, what can we do? What can we do? And we decided that we are, we're writers. We have books. She's an author. She's a novelist. I'm a new author, a nonfiction author, and a journalist. And so we decided to do a book together. And we are working on a book that's an anthology. We have reached out to more than a dozen women who have written essays. And the book is Meeting at the Table, African-American Women Write on Race, Culture, and Community. Because we wanted to not only share some of our own cultural experiences, but we wanted to inform those who are not as familiar with our culture about ways that they can learn about culture, Black culture, and to inspire them to have these conversations in their communities. And so it's an extension of journalism, but it really is about writing. And so we are very proud that book is going to come out next month. It's record time for a book because we started it in June and it's coming out in November. It just so happens that my friend Tina owns a publishing company, so that made it a little bit easier. So I wanted everybody to know that people are having these conversations, and as journalists, you really have to step out and learn other cultures. And by that, I mean, I actually addressed this in the book, Ben. I talked about when I went to my first few newsrooms, I had to learn to be bicultural. I had Black culture and I had read books by Black people. I had, enjoyed the music of Black people. But I also, especially as an English major, I had read the classics, many of the classics. I had read poetry by the classics. I had studied music and music appreciation and art appreciation by people who were not African-American, but I had African-American art and books in my home growing up and read, so many Black poets and Black authors. But when I got to my newsroom, my first newsroom, no one had read any of the Black books. No one understood Black culture. And so I had to become bicultural because I wanted to enjoy my culture, but I realized that there was some assimilation going on. And so as we, in journalism, we've had so many opportunities to train people for diversity. And part of diversity is people, but quite frankly, part of it is content. And encouraging people of all races to learn other cultures. It might mean you learn another language. It might mean you read different books and listen to different music. It might mean that you go to different kinds of restaurants. It might mean, quite frankly, that you have dinner with people or invite people into your home for dinner more frequently than you do now. So this whole multicultural movement that we're seeing is one that I hope journalists will embrace. And I think the students in the generation that you guys are teaching have the best chance for making that come to fruition.
That is fantastic little ending, I think, or a nice little spot potentially to end here. We're getting a lot of praise in the chat as well. People are very enthusiastic about your visit, and let us all look forward to a day when we can host others at our dinner table. That we're all looking forward to that. So I think with that being said, unless there's any other pressing questions, maybe we'll sort of wrap it up for the time being. I wanted to specifically thank you, Wanda, again for joining us. This has been a joy, and thanks to everybody else from the community and outside of the class who also joined. I think things went pretty smoothly, and that's more than I can say for some other Zoom meetings I've held this semester. So all of that is very good. For the time being, I'm just going to pause this very quickly.